Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third session of a lecture series entitled Global Ruptures or New Beginnings, Southern Perspectives on World Politics. We see today environmental destruction, wars, the rise of right-wing populism, and increasingly polarized international relations. What we're experiencing is clearly a time of rupture and immense change. But what feels so close to us now in Europe has felt close and personal for many people across the globe for a long time. Hence, in this lecture series, we propose that it's actually high time to hear from and show the importance of understanding the world from the lens of the majority world, like where most people in the world actually live. And that's what this lecture series aims at, to showcase the importance of understanding and analyzing the world from Southern perspective as well as from post- or decolonial approaches. That's one way of getting different perspective on some of the most important issues of the day. So the ALMA lecture series, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Asia, is an occasional lecture series organized by the Arnold-Bergstraesser-Institut at the University of Freiburg in cooperation with the colloquium Politicum. This year's lecture series is co-organized with the Decoloniality Now Center of the University of Freiburg. This initiative seeks to understand the impact of coloniality on today's world and the ways in which people and institutions in all regions of the world, including our own, remember, perpetuate, or contest the legacy of colonialism with the focus on the present day. Today's lecture series is at the same time the first Freiburg Africa talk of this semester. Hence, the Africa Center for Transregional Research is co-hosting this event. And I forgot to introduce myself, Annika Becher from the Africa Center for Transregional Research. The topic of today, Whose World, Whose Rules? African Agency in a World Remade, actually speaks to our last event on Africa's positioning in a geopolitically fragmented world, but will open up a lot of new perspectives. The lecture is also part of the initiative Science Against Fascism to address the responsibility of academia in the face of the growing fascist threat. So I now pass the floor to Dr. Franziska Zanker, Senior Researcher and Deputy Director at the Arnold-Bergstraesser-Institut, to introduce tonight's speaker and moderate this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annika. Thank you, Toni, for being here with us tonight. I'm delighted that today we are joined by Professor Toni Haastrup. I won't call you Professor Doctor, like it says on all the posters, as we like to do in Germany, and an award-winning teacher, researcher from the University of Manchester. She received her PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh and received her bachelor's and master's degree in international relations from the University of California, Davis, and the University of Cape Town, respectively. Her research and topics of focus cover a wide range, including regional security institutions, feminist peace research, the women, peace and security agenda, feminist foreign policy, Africa-EU relations, decolonial thinking, interpretive methodologies. Her research also informs policy-making institutions, news medias, and government organs on topics related to feminism and the women, peace and security agenda, and foreign policy related to Africa. As one example amongst many, she's a co-founder of the African Feminist Collective on Feminist-Informed Policies, and most recently represented them at the 5th Ministerial Conference on Feminist Foreign Policy in Madrid last week, to urge the strengthening of the connections between policy commitments and implementations for feminist causes in a changing and more threatening global atmosphere. Toni holds numerous awards, including the 2022 Emma Goldman Award for her contributions to feminist research in Europe, the ISIF Mid-Career Fellowship for her theorizations of peace through a pan-Africanist and feminist lens, and the 2025 BISA EDI Prize, which recognized her work challenging colonial legacies whilst promoting ethical partnerships in higher education. If this doesn't sound like she's already very busy, she's published over 25 journal articles, 17 book chapters, and numerous media contributions. So I don't know when you actually sleep. Amongst her most recent work published in the Third World Quarterly Journal is titled African Agency in Geopolitical Times, Playing with EU and Chinese Ontological Security, which is, I believe, related to the topic of the talk today. Her award-winning work spans numerous fields and audiences and will undoubtedly continue to make waves. So without further ado, please welcome our very esteemed guest for tonight, Toni Haastrup. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I was saying to Francisca that this is usually my bedtime, so I'm quite impressed that you're all here at the moment. Okay, so when I was asked to invite it here, I was very excited. And then I realized that I would actually have to say something. And I was thinking, how do I bring together all the things that are going on in my head in a world that is what it is? I don't need to describe that to you. So let me start with a provocation. We are meeting in a world that is being remade, however you situate yourself in that remaking. But the sort of question I want to start with, and I'm putting it out to you here, is who is doing the remaking and on whose terms? So the familiarity, or what it is that we take for granted when we're thinking about what the global order is certainly shifting. From our allies, particularly in the global north, are fractured over the direction of international politics. In the African context, China has become Africa's largest trading partner. Africa's long-standing relationship with the European Union, which is something that I tend to talk about most of the time, and one area that I'm quite familiar with in international politics, is actually right now at a structural impasse. And yet, we see a deepening relationship between some African countries and Russia through deepening military engagement across the continent, focusing on the work of private military companies, so-called security partnerships, which we know have, of course, enabled coups across the continent. In effect, what we're increasingly seeing on the African continent is the championing of the ideology of militarism, regardless of its consequences. And then we see the role of other places, other countries. So India, Turkey, the Gulf states are also all competing for influence in this new multipolar world, where Africa is increasingly described by outsiders as a battleground. So some of you might be familiar with the term, the new scramble for Africa. In any case, some folks like myself have called this moment a polycrisis, a condition that is a sort of amalgamation of a range of crises, from climate breakdown to indebtedness, armed conflict, but we also see democratic backsliding globally, as well as coordinated attacks on the gender gains, gender justice gains that we've made. And I don't think that these crises are simply compounded, but I would say that simply coinciding but rather they're compounded by each other. So I find the term polycrisis quite useful. But the thing is, for the majority of the world, what we're seeing at the moment, and in particular on the African continent, is that crises are not a novel condition. What we see as sort of arriving, say, for example, in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, or the transatlantic alliance, yes, are definitely crises, but again, for majority of the world, this has been more or less the status quo. Think, for example, in Africa, the impacts and implications of structural adjustment and the fact that it is then intertwined with the sort of debt crisis that we see in the 1990s, and the afterlives of those sorts of crises still being what most Africans are living with. What is new about our moment, our current moment, is that those who are experiencing these compounding crises are different. A lot of them are in the global north, and I would say maybe what I would say is new in particular is that a lot of the institutions that were sort of built to withstand it, and the ones that were built to sort of, were built that protected the global north from those crises I've mentioned, seem unable to deal with the nature of the crisis. And I think that that recognition matters for when we're talking about African agency in international relations. If we treat this particular moment as unprecedented, I think we will erase the long history of African states and peoples trying to navigate and survive crises, but also the international order that was designed without them and often against them. At the same time, and as I've tried to indicate, I think it is fair that we sort of highlight and recognize some of the newness, particularly with respect to the institutions. That said, where do we go next, I think is always a useful question to ask. So, to my mind, this crisis, one could also think of it as an opportunity, and I would like to discuss that in the Q&A. But across a range of domains, geopolitics, security, the central question has been the same, for me anyway, not whether African agency exists, but whether it is being expanded, constrained, or redirected. So my first call is to sort of try to avoid binary thinking when we're thinking about African agency. A lot of colleagues, a lot of folks, including colleagues that I work with, have been thinking about African agency in the academic sense for quite some time now. But when it's come up more recently, I think there's a tendency to sort of be either over-optimistic or over-pessimistic. And I want to suggest that we resist these two traps, as it were. So in the optimistic sense, one could say, the idea of multipolarity is really good for Africa, and it means, in effect, Africa has more suitors, which means that the continent as a whole has more choice. The more pessimistic outlook would say that, Africa still remains structurally trapped, that new partners will simply produce old extractive relationships, and little has changed or will change beneath the surface. And I can say that we will find, if we're looking, evidence for both of these dimensions, but I don't think that tells the full story, because I think it sort of evades some of the broader material implications of Africa's role in international relations. And I say this as a feminist scholar of Africa's international relations, someone who works both within and outside of formal institutions, someone who engages with regionalism at both the African Union level, but also in the sub-regional sense, looking at Southern and Western Africa especially, but also as someone who studies social movements, who studies how social movements get engaged with formal institutions. So I think it's really important to sort of think beyond binaries of either social movements outside of institutions or institutions alone. Because I think that that sort of binary, I think, skews what might be possible. But back to African agency. I think what thinking about African agency over the last almost 2 decades has taught me is that there is, despite the fact that you tend not to see a lot of textbooks on African foreign policy, as if foreign policy is not done by Africa, it only happens to Africa. Africa, both states and regional institutions certainly, do have agency that is historically grounded and therefore contingent, agency that is deeply contested, agency that continues to ask who gets to speak for Africa, about Africa. So in the study of Africa's international relations, agency is often articulated as the ability of either mostly African government, a particular African government, to, for example, refuse an external demand. We use it to explain when a state might secure a concession or when it maybe joins a new coalition, so leaves one international partner for another. And I think that these are really important acts, and I think they do form part of the ways in which we can think about agency. But at the same time, I think that this is agency that is working within sort of that international order that I think is being remade at the moment. Because often, most African states still have to make choices within constraints such as debt, military dependence, and indeed inherited borders that continue to prove problematic. So there are constraints here. And I think it is useful to look at the African continent and Africa's international relations through those sort of duality of agency and constraint. But at the same time, I think one of the things that I've been most concerned about is that when we're thinking about agency, so I don't necessarily see agency as being intrinsically good, a positive, or a negative, but I do think that for agency to matter, to Africans especially, it has to work for those who are not within the elite. So when I'm thinking about agency, and we have very neat definitions in a lot of the articles that Francesca was talking about, but for me, I'm sort of thinking about not simply the ability to act, but importantly, the ability to shape the conditions under which action takes place, to define the terms of engagement, not merely respond to them. And I think that this distinction matters throughout. And the question is whether African countries individually, collectively have actually been able to do this. And I would suggest that in some ways, in certain instances, they have been, but in others, not so much. But I also think agency, we can think of agency as genealogy, that the reasons why we're asking questions about whether Africa has agency now did not just start in the last few years. It already started with the articulation of African positions in the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1945 in Manchester, or the Bandung Conference in 1955, when newly independent states gathered to imagine an international order that moved beyond empire. So there are sort of those ideas and ideologies about what African agency can be already. And in that sense, for me, to truly sort of achieve African agency, we cannot separate that movement, the desire to do and be more, to be able to shape what the international is, without recovering the ambitions of the anti-colonial struggle, and indeed the ambitions of feminists, of African women within the anti-colonial struggle. And I'll come to that in a moment. So when we speak about African agency today, we are not simply describing a new capacity, but rather probably a new, so it's not new in of itself, but we do have a new opportunity to sort of recover some of these ambitions. And I think it's important to note that I think it is especially important that that is happening now when you have entities like the European Union that says, you know, Africa is really important to the future of the EU. And that's a shift, actually. So before it was that, you know, Europe has this partnership with Africa, and there was a lot of things taken for granted. But there is an attempt now, at least rhetorically, to meet Africa on its own terms. And the question is, can Africa actually articulate those terms? So tonight I want to make three arguments. First, that multipolarity gives African states leverage, certainly, and this is where you might find some of those examples that I alluded to earlier, but leverage itself does not necessarily convert to agency. And I think part of why we continue to have issues with the ability to achieve agency is because of how African states and institutions have chosen to respond to challenges. And in this case, I will focus on security, the security dimension, because that's the area that I'm most familiar with. So I am suggesting that the sort of increased militarization, masculine approaches to leadership that we see on the continent as a response to this disorder, when we're supposed to be thinking about more positive forms of African agency, simply reproduce the very order that African leaders are claiming to want to escape. And to that end, I think demilitarization has to be an urgent Pan-African imperative. And third, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear me say that we do already actually have answers on the African continent, and those answers are rooted in Pan-Africanism, but a specific feminist Pan-Africanism. And I think that each of these areas speak to different dimensions of where the gaps are in articulating African agency and what African agency might demand. So in the work that I've done with some colleagues, we've looked at African agency in the context of geopolitics. And we focused in the article on Third World Quarterly, for example, on the ways in which African states are navigating larger actors like the European Union and China. One of our motivations for this was because we felt very uncomfortable with that phrase, scramble for Africa, which again harkens back to colonialism. But also the fact that in a lot of this rhetoric around the scramble for Africa, the focus still tends to be on who those big actors are. So in our case, the EU and China, rather than Africa's positions or Africa's own ideas about indeed what the relationship with the EU or China, with the EU and China should look like. So we look at a very specific case. And that case was quite illustrative because what we found was that African governments were actually engaging these actors very strategically anyway. So regardless of the fact that a lot of the literature tended to focus on what the EU was doing in Global Gateway or what China was doing with respect to the Belt and Road initiatives, there wasn't a lot of focus on, how are African countries actually responding to those things and how are they articulating their own needs within those. And so we see African governments trying to leverage their positions to get better terms on debt, on infrastructure, and indeed on trade. And I think that this matters very much because, yes, this might just be very empirical examples, but I think they help us create a picture, another picture otherwise, of the ways in which we can look at Africa as an actor in its own right in international relations, not simply a space to be acted upon. Of course, this is quite narrow because, again, it is just about using very specific leverage. And as I said before, at the end of the day, for me anyway, whatever it is that African elites are able to negotiate, quote unquote, on behalf of Africa, it has to have resonance with the citizens. So we will not necessarily make the case that, what they're able to achieve in this context are necessarily, it could potentially, but simply having that leverage in of itself does not agency make. But we do see the ways in which these specific African elites are able to sort of negotiate terms of engagement, but it is still the case that they're not necessarily able to shape the rules of the game. And so there isn't always a consistency in terms of the wins, as it were. So when moving back to now Africa-EU relations, the case that we use looking at the EU, China, and its relationship with African countries was a fascinating one that started specifically because, you had this new European Union rhetoric of wanting to change the relationship. And it was a very frustrating one because the EU has been trying to change the relationship since 2005. So why isn't the relationship changing exactly? Well, from the side of the EU, we have argued that part of why the EU-Africa relationship isn't changing is partly because the EU's own self of self is dependent on the nature of this hierarchical relationship. So on the one hand, the EU claims to want it to change, but it can't change because that is part of what the European Union is. And why is this important? Why am I talking about the EU here? Well, African elites are very aware that this is very much the case. So it's no longer enough to sort of say, we now want a partnership of equals. They're saying, yes, potentially your ontological security must be upset in order for us to actually change dynamics, but we're no longer going to wait for the next summit, which happens every 2 years, for you to say the same thing over and over again. And I think this is indication that, whether we like it or not, African governments certainly understand the rules of the game. They are learning to play the game, as it were. But again, whether it's an AU-EU summit, Russia-Africa summit, US-Africa summit, that in of itself does not reshape the game. It's still, in a sense, reproducing the same of the same. And this is especially important in my case, at least in the work that I've been doing, because agency that is truly transformative, that wants to really change the rules of the game, we sort of see hints of what that could look like and how we might benefit the African continent in the African Union's Agenda 2063. And in 2063, there is an envisioning of a self-reliant, economically integrated, and united continent. And this is significant because, again, this is a sort of hearkening back to the idea that pan-Africanism as an ideology and as a political project is a useful one, and it's a useful pathway through which Africa and Africans can articulate agency better. And we can look at regional organizations in Africa as a pathway through which this pan-Africanism is being articulated. And I would say, again, there are elements of that in there, but increasingly we see these regional institutions reproducing the same things that have always been there. So reinforcing the same hierarchies that we might find between the global north and the global majority. But are there possibilities of writing the rules differently? So one more recent initiatives that we've seen is through the African Continental Free Trade Area, which on paper would be the largest free trade area in the world by membership, and ostensibly represents a serious attempt in a generation to address some of the structural weaknesses that we found in other regional institutions, but indeed in the international more broadly. But success, I think, this is still very much at the beginning, so it's very hard to make a judgment. But I think success has to be carefully defined, because even the idea of free trade area itself is not necessarily, is something that, of course, very much leans into neoliberalism and capitalism. It's one that is endorsed by a lot of large actors in the world, including the European Union, for example, who's been really supportive of it. So are we going to get a new framework that excludes or displaces women who participate in informal border trade, for example? Or is this going to be a framework where everybody is able to benefit? So what I'm trying to say here is that there are already seeds for how things can go with respect to African agency, but we're still stuck in a space where who benefits is mainly still elites, which I think has to be important because elites tend to negotiate on behalf of African states and African people, but it's certainly not enough. And multipolarity has allowed for rapid progress on that front. But the ability for elite bargaining, for example, is not going to respond to the dangers and the harm that has been caused, for example, by climate change. It certainly is in no way, shape, or form responding to the insecurity that plagues the continent. And that's where I want to turn next. Across the continent, the dominant response to insecurity has been more security, in the worst sense of the word. So if I've sort of made that point around ways in which African countries and institutions are able to sort of navigate the international, not by upending it, but by leveraging it in the economic sense, I think that the realm of security deserves looking into. Most of you here will be familiar with the fact that after the wave of democratization we saw in the 90s, we are now back to a situation where we have quite a few military coups and a few military juntas, and even when we don't have military juntas, we have so-called democratic governments governing as if they were lawless military. So in Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, to name a few, these places are under have been impacted by the influence and influx of private militaries. But I think it's really important to say, nowadays when we talk about private militaries, it's really easy to sort of focus on Russia, and Russia is certainly there, but it's not just Russia. So whoever you think your best friends are, they're in there too. We can talk about that later. So think, for example, about Western counterterrorism frameworks that demand increased militarization, and they're consistently prioritize force projection over political legitimacy and indeed human security. So folks often ask me, but yes, coups are bad, but this coup seemed quite popular with a lot of young people. And I say, again, thinking about these best friends of yours, part of why they tend to be popular is because for years and years and years, a lot of the governments that those military coups ousted were supported by so-called democratic countries supporting authoritarianism in Africa. So you remember at the very beginning I said to you that, we see now democratic backsliding. Well, that's something that has been the case for a lot of African countries. And now that it is happening elsewhere, we are paying attention. But coups are bad, and I think it's really important to say that. The coups that we've seen happening, the increased militarism that we see happening under military dictatorships in Africa are, yes, examples of agency. Remember I said to you earlier that agency, you can't necessarily always count on it being a good thing. But this is precisely the example, the sort of bad example, because we know that coups close out civic space. They militarize everyday life. They elevate precisely the model of masculinized, securitized authority that has failed the continent repeatedly, and I would say really anywhere in the world. There is no, and I will say this, I always say this to my students, but I'll say it here, there is no context within which increased militarization will lead to emancipation and liberation. They are freedom fighters that have taken up the gun in self-determination so that they can be self-determined to drop the gun, to demilitarize. So what we're seeing in Africa now, to my mind anyway, is not a pathway towards liberation, but I guess it's a good cautionary tale. But I'm not the first person to say this. African feminists have been saying this for a very long time, which is why there was a lot of celebration for the formal adoption of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Because when the Women, Peace and Security Agenda was formally adopted in the UN Security Council in 2000, this was a sort of signal that wow, we are finally being heard at the highest levels. Like, folks finally understand that those who suffer the most from these militarized environments are the women, and that women have something to say about the ways in which we can think differently about what security and insecurity means. And in Africa, the WPS agenda was also adopted into institutions, so all sub-regional organizations have some sort of framework around the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The African Union itself has the Continental Results Framework, which is there to sort of monitor uptake of this. But as I've argued in other work, even though something like the Women, Peace and Security agenda, or at least the ambitions that are contained within that, was supposed to inform a new African peace and security architecture that takes seriously feminist concerns around militarization, but also takes seriously feminist concerns around uneven debt systems, why we need to look at climate change if we care anything about security at all, why we should be inclusive in whatever it is that we're doing. We have not really seen that fully mainstreamed within the Africa's peace and security architecture. And here, again, where we have the possibility of having people agency working with institutional agency, we've not actually quite met the challenge. And my concern now is that this agenda in of itself is now facing coordinated backlash. One of the things that my current research tries to do is look at the ways and the different mechanisms through which the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa is actively being undermined, sometimes overtly, but often covertly. So most of you here will be familiar. We've been talking earlier about ODA cuts, and the fact that you might sort of think an ODA cut in the UK, what would that have to do with anything in the African Union or indeed any other African country? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because often it means that sort of that work of advancing that African women's and feminist visions and agency is no longer articulated. But I think for me, the other bit that ties into it is, if we've argued that African agency is possible when folks are able to shape the terms and the condition of things, it also fully illustrates the dependency, the aid dependency of a lot of those institutions, of those spaces that are able to help articulate African agency. And the backlash is, of course, transnational, which makes it even harder. But I always think there's an answer, which is feminism and African feminisms in particular. And I think that that's been reaffirmed in the in the context of the 25-year celebration of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I think a feminist critique of militarism, and that's really important here, which will bring me to the sort of third part, is not simply talking about women, bringing women to the table when necessary, or to talk about women's issues. But that knowledge, that African feminist knowledge, helps us understand the harms of militarism and how it works in that very specific context. That militarism entrenches patriarchal, colonial, and neocolonial power dynamics, normalizes violence as a mode of governance, and consistently shifts the cost of insecurity onto those who have been historically marginalized, be they women, LGBTQ people, poor people. And often, these are those folks who have the least power to resist. And I can give a range of examples, but I'll keep it short. Right now, I'm working on Sudan a lot, and as you can imagine, it is the world's worst humanitarian crises. So even if you don't hear about it on the news as some of the other ones, it is pretty dire there, and that's putting it politely. So when I think about spaces like Sudan, when I think about spaces like Cameroon, like the DRC, I see the actual costs of a militarized model of governance, a cost that constrains agency for ordinary people. And I think that this is no longer tenable. I think that our institutions on the African continent, in particular, because this is the area I look at, the African Union is also a union of states, need to think about alternatives if they truly care about both the stated aims of the Union, as we see in the Constitutive Act, or the ambitions of Agenda 2063. So I think the questions we tend to ask about African agency needs to move beyond the ways that we know now to really go through those alternatives. And in a sense, the alternative is not new, as I've suggested. I think pan-Africanism can be something that we return to, and I would actually say it's quite urgent, but in a feminist variant. So pan-Africanism is, to my mind, more than a call for continental unity. It is, of course, a political philosophy that is rooted in liberation, but it's also a refusal of the racial and imperial hierarchies that have rendered Africa peripheral and its people expendable. It is also a commitment to building the collective power to change that. Born from anti-colonial resistance and diasporic solidarity, Pan-Africanism envisions a world in which African peoples can shape their own futures on their own terms. So if the previous sections have tried to show you the first previous sections, the two parts, have tried to show you the sort of limitations and distortions of what agency is or has been and under the current condition. This third part, I think, I want to illustrate the ways in which we can think about African agency in more expansive ways. As I've said, Pan-Africanism is not necessarily new. We sort of see it already in the institutions on the continent. The African Union I've talked about, but in its predecessor, the Organization for African Unity. But as I've also suggested, a lot of times these institutions have reproduced the same hierarchies within the international system, and especially by excluding the perspectives of those who are most marginalized. The feminist intervention I'm calling for draws on the work of thinkers like Ugandan feminist Sylvia Tamale and Nigerian feminist Amina Mama, just to name two, and ongoing research on feminist Pan-Africanism as a framework for Africa's international. In a sense, this feminist outlook also really tries to rethink Pan-Africanism's foundations of what constitutes political agency. Today, when you look at a country like Burkina Faso that is mired in a military dictatorship, some folks tell you that it reminds them of Thomas Sankara, which to my mind, I can see the faces and I agree with you. I think it's a distortion, as we've seen before, of the ambitions of Sankara. Because the part that nobody tells you about, which I find really fascinating, is Sankara placed women's liberation, what we would consider to be African feminisms, at the heart of Burkina Faso's revolutionary project. That there can be no genuine social transformation without transformation of gender relations. And even if we take that as the revolutionary intent, then we have to be open to feminist Pan-Africanism. So what could that look like in practice? Economically, it would reject neoliberal consensus that I think has dominated Africa's development, which a lot of African elites still continue to work within. And I wouldn't suggest that it means retreating necessarily from the international, but by insisting on an economic model that recognizes and values the labors that sustains African communities and actually making the argument for that. My suggestion isn't that this is going to change tomorrow or that it's necessarily going to be welcome with open arms, but I find it really interesting that, within the European Union today, we are talking about care societies and care economies as something that is appropriate for European society. So why not Africa? After all, our counterparts and colleagues in Latin America are doing the same. Such an approach will prioritize climate justice, understanding that ecological collapse reinforces poverty and conflict in ways that women and other marginalized communities bear disproportionately. It will deliver a pan-Africanist continental trade arrangement that is meaningful for women and gender minorities, but that means everybody, and one that doesn't always favor and benefit the elites or indeed multinational corporation. And yes, a lot of feminist political economists would say the same, so I say, really, let's listen to them. In terms of security, as I've tried to suggest, I would say that demilitarization is not just a good thing to do. I would actually call it a pan-Africanist imperative. That, as being anti-militarist, I think it's a conversation I have with colleagues a lot. That does not necessarily mean pacifism. But I think there has to be a recognition that the resources that are currently being poured into increased militarization, arms purchases, this foreign security partnership, could be better redirected to community-level peace building. Diplomatically, it would also mean sort of taking the perspectives and knowledge of African women and feminists into international relations that is participatory and is accountable. And this is the lesson that I draw from Africa itself, not necessarily from what happens here in Europe, which is where I'm based. So I've been talking for a really long time, and I'm going to stop because I'm really keen to hear from you. So let me close by saying that the sort of transformative politics that I'm wanting, that I'm describing, is not one that I think we have to wait too long for, if only we pay attention to what has come before us and what is around us. I would say it's already happening, actually, in small pockets on the African continent, in feminist movements, amongst youth activists, community organizers. Again, I can talk about Sudan as an example and why that is really being pushed back against. The challenge that we have is, of course, institutional and political, because yes, there are forces that exist often way beyond the capacity of individuals, but I don't think that that should be discouraging. And this is where I want to return back to this sort of multipolar world. If it is a space of leverage for elites, then it has to be a space of leverage for other people. It creates openings through which agency that is actually beneficial to Africans may begin to emerge. Agency that has the power to define what it is that Africans want, agency to redistribute resources, agency to determine whose voice counts in the international. And I want to say something around leadership, because I think at the end of the day, we do need leadership, and I don't mean like a singular person, but we sort of need a bold vision, bold leadership. And I think that, again, really rests in this African feminist intellectual tradition, who in one way or the other have been trying to sort of theorize the ways in which our elites can actually lead better. And I think, if anything I have said this evening is right, then I think because of where we are, there is a question for, I think, European policymakers and scholars, especially, mostly because, for lack of a better term, there's always been this claim to a special relationship, and what we found in that special relationship is that it's actually contributed to some of those constraints in agency that I've been talking about. There is an opportunity to re-engage with the African continents in a different way, despite this era of so-called great power competition. I think that Europe must be willing to sort of put itself out there, not just always simply adjusting to the other great powers, but to engaging African countries and institutions on their own terms. Otherwise, this partnership that has been taken for granted for so long will not survive. And for those of us in the academy, because of course I have to say something about knowledge production, I think a lot of the ways in which we think about the international, there's a lot of decolonial projects in most universities now, my university being one of them. But there's a difference, I think, between sort of studying the decolonial in theoretical terms and then in our actual praxis. And I think this is something that I'm also thinking about a lot. African experience often appear as data, as case studies, but Africa and Africans are never sites for theorizing. And invariably that means we end up excluding important experiences that can sort of form these pathways to change. I think for agency to proceed beyond constraint, there has to be solidarity, even in that space of knowledge making, not just posture. I'm going to finish now and sort of say, I think that there are opportunities in the current moment, despite how dire things are. And I'm sure everybody here can think of an example from their own neighborhood or their own country about how things are really, really dire. But the one thing I have learned studying institutions is that, moments of crisis are also moments of potential change. And I think that there is an opportunity for the ways in which we think about Africa as international, the ways in which we engage with Africa in the international change, but also the ways that African elites and Africans on the continent think about themselves in relation to the world. There's an opportunity for change here. And of course, here I'm advocating a sort of more feminist outlook. And I'll finish by saying that some people might leave here thinking, gosh, she's really naive about all the challenges that African countries have to overcome, or feel quite defensive about all the other wonderful things that we've been doing. That's okay too. The idea is not, I'm not trying to be defensive, but I'm also saying, I'm not being naive. And part of why I say that I'm not being naive is because I don't think I'm not actually saying anything new. All of this has always been there. But I'm saying that we have the opportunity to grab on to those things that have always been there if we want the change that we claim to want. And I'll end there. Thank you for listening.